be surveying rhythms and metrical practices in an Afro-Colombian folk genre called Currulao. I've been familiar with and interested in this genre since I was very young, and in the summer of 2018, I was lucky enough to take private lessons in Colombia and have attended many concerts in Bogotá since, where I've interacted with members of various Currulao ensembles. I propose in this paper that some of the most pervasive rhythmic patterns in this dance genre can be understood through an addition to Harold Krebs's theory of metrical dissonance, namely through the incorporation of a pulse dissonance model. Currulao is the most popular folk genre from the Pacific region of Colombia, shown in blue on the left side of the map. Although originally a religious music melding African traditions with the Catholicism imposed upon Black Colombians, Currulao performance is an ever-evolving genre, and today it is just as often secular, often about topics of love, the performer's homeland, or nature. Performances take place in a wide variety of cultural spaces, including celebrations, funerals known as chigualos, and jam sessions. Since 1997, it is performed in the yearly Festival Petronio Álvarez, a competition featuring a wide variety of Pacific coastal genres. The primary melodic and harmonic instrument in the genre is the marimba de chonta. The marimba's bars are made of chonta palm, with resonators built from a bamboo called guadua. This diatonic instrument is generally played by two performers. One stands on the left side of the marimba de chonta and plays a 2-measure-long low-register ostinato called the bordón, which alternates between tonic and dominant harmonies every measure. This 2-measure-long ostinato can be referred to as the cyclic key pattern, taking after Peñalosa's terminology in clave matrix. In the Pacific, this performer's role is nicknamed marimba bordón. The other performer stands on the right side of the marimba, playing the upper register. This performer is said to be playing the marimba requinta part, which is the primary non-vocal melodic line, or Peñalosa's so-called lead, that improvises ornaments over the bordón's ostinato. Normally, whoever plays the marimba requinta part in a Currulao ensemble is considered virtuoso and is the leader of the group. Other instruments in a Currulao ensemble include 2 cununo drums, 2 bombo bass drums, and a type of rain stick called a guasa. Normally, when there are 2 of the same drum type, there is a male and female role assigned to each. The male or macho drum plays a standard repeating pattern, while the respective female or hembra instrument improvises over that pattern. The vocalists often include one soloist and a chorus of women who sing in a responsorial manner. Most of you are probably familiar with Krebs's theory of metrical dissonance. For those of you who might not be, I will provide a brief introduction to the concepts. The theory is described in depth by Harold Krebs in his book, Fantasy Pieces, Metrical Dissonance in the Music of Robert Schumann. The pulse layer in this theory contains the fastest pervasive series of pulses. These pulses are grouped together to form interpretive layers of slower pulses. The interpretive layer, that is the reference point for all rhythmic activity in the piece, is called the primary metrical layer, and non-alignment of interpretive layers yields metrical dissonance. According to the theory, there are 2 types of metrical dissonance: displacement dissonance, when an accented or otherwise emphasized pulse is shifted forwards or backwards in one interpretive layer, and grouping dissonance, where the pulse emphases in different layers contrast in cardinality. Before moving forward, I'd like to address one philosophical problem posed by the use of this model on the music at hand. Most people would define dissonance of any kind as a function whose purpose in itself is to resolve, a very European idea. James Burns, in particular, has rejected the use of the metrical or rhythmic dissonance metaphor in Afro-diasporic music, instead calling patterns arising from apparent dissonances rhythmic integration or composite rhythm, clarifying that certain patterns are not felt as dissonant, but rather as inherent parts of the groove of certain genres. He is certainly correct that most of what might be labeled a metrical dissonance in Currulao is indeed not felt like a dissonance at all. However, most of the specific patterns I intend on discussing in this paper, although very common and highly characteristic of the genre at hand, are also often highlighted as metrical dissonances. They are purposefully dizzying in thin introductory textures and do end up resolving or at least evolving into different and less shocking patterns as the texture thickens. The Currulao recording that I used for this study is a performance by Grupo Naidi of a piece titled Adiós Guapi, which is from their album Arriba Suena Marimba. The notated ostinato is played by the lower register marimba player, the marimba bordón. Adiós Guapi begins quietly, with this idiomatic bordón alternating between tonic and minor dominant harmonies every measure. later iterations of this ostinato, the other percussive instruments in the genre join in, filling in every eighth note that is not articulated by the bordón. This constant and pervasive stream of eighth notes created by the combined rhythms of all of the instruments leads me to determine the eighth note layer as the pulse layer in this genre. This ostinato can also easily be described using standard vocabulary of Afro-diasporic music. There are 4 main beats in the cycle, embodied by the dancer's steps. These beats are not to be confused with the faster pulse layer. Although when using Krebs's theory, the beat and the pulse layers are often the same, that is not necessarily always the case. The 4 beats of the 2/6/8 measures are divided into opposing cells. Here the first 2 beats are on the tonic side and the last 2 beats are on the minor dominant side, separated by the bar line. Each beat, of course, has 3 pulses, so each side or measure has 6 eighth note pulses, shown by the time signature I decided to assign the excerpt. To show this in a more cyclic way, here it is visualized in circular form. In this clock face visual, each number around the circle represents an eighth note pulse, in which the numbers 1 and 7 represent the downbeats of the ostinato, and 4 and 10 show the other 2 primary beats. So I'm going to sing along with the circle going around it clockwise, singing the eighth note pulses. So it would go 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8, 10, 11, 1, and so on. So this cyclic notation shows the 4 poles, the opposing tonic and dominant cells, and the repetitive nature of the ostinato more clearly. Let's listen to the first few seconds of the piece again, and for a slightly longer excerpt, noticing that the not notated marimba requinta upper voice enters in the 3rd measure. I encourage you to try tapping your foot to the 2 beats of the bordón 6/8 key pattern like the dancers would. The rhythms may have sounded random and messy after the requinta join if you're unfamiliar with the genre. But it was actually a very precise pattern common in the marimba requinta and voice parts of Currulaos that I'll now begin to analyze. In the example of Adiós Guapi, the repeating bordón ostinato features 6 eighth note pulses in each measure, creating, in Krebs's terminology, a 6 layer, emphasizing every notated downbeat which coincides with each harmonic change. However, the marimba requinta stream shown in the upper staff never features an onset on the downbeat. It does, however, feature a prominent attack on the last eighth notes of each measure, so this pattern of the last eighth note continues past the excerpt shown on the screen. Therefore, since the requinta also features a strong onset every 6 eighth note pulses, like the bordón stream, but starts 1 eighth note early, the resulting displacement dissonance could be labeled D6-1, highlighting this anticipatory sounding 6th layer where the melodic motion begins. The 6 in the notated displacement dissonance refers to the number of pulses between strongest emphases in both layers, and the -1 refers to the requinta line that begins 1 eighth note early from the downbeats played by the bordón. The marimba requinta entrance in measure 3 only introduces one part of the metrical story, the degree of displacement. In measure 4, the full metrical complexity of that layer is established. A listener unfamiliar with the Currulao genre might expect each group of 6 displaced eighth notes to divide into 2 groups of 3 eighth notes because of the prevalence of that division in the bordón. However, the marimba requinta does not follow this metrical division quite as expected. Instead, the temporal span is split into 2 equal groups of 2. So the displaced 6 pulses divide into 2 spaces of 3 eighth note pulses, each of which further divides into 2 1.5 pulses. Thinking about it bottom up as Krebs would instead of top down, this could perhaps be considered a type of grouping dissonance. However, the emphasis every 3 eighth note pulses is constant, shown under blue brackets, and what is truly dissonant is a layer faster than this grouping, shown in orange. Krebs gets around similar metrical issues by taking a subdivision or micropulse as the pulse, which in this example would be the 16th note. Although the analysis does appear much neater when taking the 16th note as the pulse, I do not believe that it's an adequate analytical decision for this particular genre. None of the performers or enculturated listeners are thinking in 16th notes, and do not perceive the 16th note as the underlying rhythmic pulse that this analysis implies. Thinking of the 16th note subdivision is actually essentially impossible during most Currulaos, not only because the tempo is too fast, but also because strong microtiming shifts take place constantly between these 2 metrical layers. Consequently, the 16th note pulse is not compatible with the experience of the music, as it is neither exact nor pervasive, as Krebs requires. Therefore, I propose a new labeling system for this type of metrical dissonance, pulse dissonance. For this new type of labeling, one can clarify what the specific pulse layer P is by using common rhythmic notation at the beginning and separating the value of the two or more dissonant pulses with a forward dash, used like in grouping dissonance labels. So over here on the top left, you see P eighth note dash dotted eighth note. P eighth note refers to the bottom staff bordon, which has an eighth note as the pulse layer. And this is happening simultaneously to, is what the dash means, a dotted eighth note pulse, which is happening in the top requinta staff. And here I elected to put the eighth note before the dotted eighth note, while Krebs usually puts the larger note value or number first, because I feel that the bordon is a primary metrical layer embodied by the dancer's feet, and that the requinta line is the dissonant line. The groupings can also be labeled for each pulse layer without decimals and without interpreting the subdivision or micropulse as the pulse. So here G 3/8 note dash 2 dotted eighth note refers to 3/8 note pulses that are grouped together in the bottom bordon staff. The 3 is shown under the blue brackets, and this is happening simultaneously to 2 dotted eighth note pulses that are grouped together in the top requinta staff, also the 2 shown in blue brackets. And lastly, we have the displacement dissonance label, D 4 dotted eighth note minus 1 eighth note. This refers to the 4 layer that was previously a 6 layer in the top requinta staff, created from 4 dotted eighth note pulses instead of 6 eighth note pulses, and this is happening 1 eighth note early from the bordon downbeats. So, therefore, one of Currulao's fundamental dissonances, assuming all Currulaos contain the same dissonance as the first few measures of Adios Guapi, would be labeled P eighth note dash dotted eighth note, G 3/8 note dash 2 dotted eighth note, and D 4 dotted eighth note minus 1 eighth note. In most Currulaos, the only line besides the requinta that strongly emphasizes the dotted eighth note pulse layer is the voice. In Adios Guapi, the solo voice repeats the melody shown in the top staff various times, with long instrumental breaks between each repetition. So now that I've gone through a significant amount of talking without much listening to the professionals, let's listen to a bit of a longer section of this piece. I encourage you to tap or conduct to the 2 beats of each 6/8 measure by following the marimba bordon in the lower staff, and notice how the voice and the requinta, when it comes in, plays against this ostinato. The idea of pulse dissonance is not a new one for scholars in the Afro-diasporic music analysis subfield. This phenomenon that I'm describing is much like Willy Anku's cross set, James Burns' rhythmic archetype 2, also known as the medium interweave, or David Locke's 8-feel in ternary quadruple time. However, in this Currulao example, the primary metrical layer bordon ostinato and the dotted eights are displaced from one another. So although Adios Guapi can be considered a type of cross set with an added displacement, because of the displacement, it cannot be felt as a normal on-beat 3 against 2 cross rhythm. Looking at the Currulao marimba patterns again from a more cyclic perspective, one can observe that the bordon and the requinta or voice patterns rarely align. In an entire cycle of 24 16th notes instead of the 12 8th notes that we saw previously, the 2 only align once, on the 5th 16th note or the 3rd 8th note. So if it cannot be felt like a standard cross rhythm, and the 2 parts only align once on a weak pulse per cycle, How is this pulse dissonance felt? In the midst of the metrically dissonant and dizzying complexities that are present in Currulao, one might question whether the musicians and listeners are constantly aware of the full ensemble of rhythmic factors. Since the layers are complex and arguably polymetric, it can be insisted upon that each performer or listener only fully perceives the line that they are playing or are focused on. Justin London would likely argue that it is impossible for a listener or performer to perceive both metrical layers simultaneously and independently. The way that I was taught to sing the metrically dissonant vocal line by my teacher, the anthropologist and composer Samir Aldana, was by first learning the song as separate in a 2/4 meter, and then superimposing that onto 6/8, conceptualizing the part as jumping off of the third eighth note pulse in the male cununo or cununo macho part that I was also playing, which is firmly in 6/8. Both the vocal line and the cununo are notated here, and the third and 6/8 note anchors are highlighted. I was encouraged to begin the sung line where the two layers align on the third eighth note, an open cununo hit, and was told to split the time in half with my voice between that and 3/8 notes later, where the next open cununo hit occurred. Although this took practice and extreme focus, it eventually led me to play the 6/8 line and sing the displaced duple line simultaneously, dividing the equal space of 3/8 notes into contrasting pulses with my voice and with my hands. So I'm going to do a quick demonstration on a bombo instead of a cununo because I don't have access to a cununo. So how I learned to do this was by imagining that the top voice line was in 2/4, for example, a simple duple meter, and just doing that part alone with my right hand on the cununo macho. So mañana me voy de Guapu, and then adding my left hand with the 6/8 part. So mañana me voy de Guapu. So I was tricking myself in some part of my brain to think that the third and 6/8 note anchors of each measure were strong beats, beginning the cross rhythm there instead of on the downbeats. Although this methodology that I'm describing was a pedagogical exercise used on me by my teacher, who was also not from the Pacific Coast, it seems like a particularly interesting way to conceptualize the rhythmic patterns of Currulao. It emphasizes the understanding of one line in many metrical contexts. To native performers and listeners, it is possible that the complex rhythmic patterns are so ingrained in their musical culture that they become one unary gestalt sound, not heard as two separate streams. In closing, although many scholars have alluded to or expressly mentioned the concept of pulse dissonance, perhaps this more systematic approach to Krebs's theory of metrical dissonance opens new avenues for study, in particular when the music in question cannot be felt like a cross rhythm in the standard way. In the case of Currulao, the relatively fast tempo, micro-timing shifts, and displacement dissonance makes the typical 3/2 cross-rhythmic approach used on similar rhythmic patterns not particularly useful for performance. Instead, although Southern Pacific Colombians would likely not have to be taught in this way, the pedagogical approach used on me encourages perceptual multiplicity and a reading of the music as dissonant in the pulse layer levels. My hope is, paraphrasing Kofi Agawu in Representing African Rhythm, that my appropriation of Krebs's methodology and inflection of it in order to more accurately represent the structure of the music has served a purpose in clarifying some of the rhythmic processes at play in Currulaos such as Adios Guapi. My hope is also that the resulting pulse dissonance model will find uses in analysis of a wider range of repertoire than Krebs's model is currently capable of, rendering it useful for both music from the Afro-diasporic tradition, as I have hopefully shown here, and music from many other traditions, including music perhaps more familiar to people watching this, such as excerpts from Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, minimalist music with phasing, or analysis of sounds at protest, just to name a few potential avenues for study. Thank you.